Welcome to another interview conducted by EFSAS, and this time we're interviewing Dr. Matthew Walton on the situation in Myanmar. Matthew Walton is an assistant professor in comparative political theory in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, and previously he was a senior research fellow in Modern Burmese Studies at the Antony College at the University of Oxford. And your research has mainly focused on religion and politics in Southeast Asia, with a special emphasis on Buddhism in Myanmar. And Dr. Walton's first book, Buddhism, Politics and Political Thought in Myanmar, was published in 2016. And you have been contributing through articles on Buddhism, ethnicity, politics, and political thought in Myanmar. And these have appeared in various international journals and other publications. Dr. Walton, welcome.
Thanks so much, Junaid, and to EFSAS. It's great to be here.
Now, well, like I told you before we started in the beginning, is that one of the most obvious questions, and which we also like to ask the people we interview, is that you are an American. And you have, studied Myanmar more than people from South Asia or Myanmar might have done. So what prompted your interest in this particular region in this country?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have a somewhat odd academic trajectory anyway, because my first degree was in music composition. And so I had a kind of previous life as a composer and an opera composer before, eventually after undergraduate, switching more to focus on religion and politics sort of in Asia broadly. And then that came down to focus on Myanmar. And really the reason why is because my first visit to Myanmar almost 20 years ago now was with a friend, and we did a meditation retreat there. And so I hesitate to use the word fusion because that invokes all these sort of weird images. But so this was a retreat at a Burmese monastery where it was mostly non-Burmese people there meditating, about a month long. And we received what I might call like classical teachings in Vipassana or insight meditation from Burmese monks. And then also every other day, what we might call a kind of conceptual translation teaching from monks and nuns, mostly Americans, who had studied in Burma and Myanmar for years. And so this was, for me, I would describe as a kind of spiritual coming home. That's the tradition that I, kind of identify with and practice in now. So there was that kind of interest and foundation. But the other thing that happened was right at the end of this retreat, one of the Americans who had been a monk in Myanmar told us about his time in the 90s, and he had studied with one of the more prominent monks in the country. And so, late 80s, early 90s is when Aung San Suu Kyi was kind of coming into her own in Myanmar politics and, spending some time under house arrest and things like that, but really starting to think and write about Buddhism, politics, democracy, all these sorts of things. And this monk thought, well, yeah, she's Myanmar, but she grew up in, India and Oxford for most of her time. Maybe it makes sense to have this Westerner talk to her about Buddhism. So then this teacher conveyed to us the kind of conversations that they had, during what I would kind of describe as this period of intellectual ferment for her, right? She's really starting to make those connections in a lot of her writings. This is when we see the freedom from fear and things like that coming up. And so I was just intrigued by this, right? I mean, having learned some of more of the meditation and having known some of the general outlines of Buddhism, right? Then I proceeded to kind of see the rest of my time in Myanmar and across Theravada Buddhist Southeast Asia through this lens, right? What are the ways that people are kind of enacting, their Buddhist beliefs or practices through politics? And that's really what kind of focused me on that path to look at Buddhist political thought and Buddhist politics.
Okay. No, we'll of course come in the interview about your study of Buddhism and politics in Myanmar. But to just get a little bit of a background from you is that that they say that Myanmar is the country with the longest lasting civil war in the world. And it has now been almost 1.5 years since the army overthrew the democratically elected government of Suu Kyi and her party, the National League for Democracy. So two things. Why this timing? Why did it happen then when it happened? And why has it been so difficult, despite the popular belief, of course, which we also talked about, Buddhism being a very, peaceful, which eventually all religions claim to be, but Buddhism has this in the West also, the perception that it's a very peaceful religion. Why has it been so difficult to end civil war in Myanmar, and why this overtake by the army?
Yeah. So we'll kind of deal with both of those separately here, and maybe I'll try to address the kind of like ongoing conflict and civil war question first, and then we'll come to the more recent coup. So, what we call Myanmar today is obviously, this sort of like pieced together country, like many kind of post-colonial countries. That doesn't mean it didn't have earlier reference points, but, many of the areas that are in it, the kind of what we call the ethnic states, were not always or not officially kind of part of an earlier, Myanmar Burmese kingdom, right? They were sometimes vassal states. They sometimes had other relationships, things like that. And so, British colonization brought things together sometimes in awkward ways, but then post-independence also formalized a lot of those relationships in nation-state boundaries, right? Which created new obligations, right? Created new identities for people. And so the lead up to independence in 1948 was still a country, well, still not yet a country, right? A territory with a number of intersecting and overlapping identities, right? So you had ethnic identities, you have religious identities, and you also had a really strong sense of class at that time, right? So you had a lot of activism from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, looking at kind of like class differences as well. And a lot of these persisted then, through independence, through the 1950s, persisted in resistance movements, right? Persisted through eventually, kind of independence movements against the state. And what a number of scholars have described throughout the 1950s is the Myanmar military and the Burmese at that point, military and government, early days of independence, barely controlling most of the country, right? Really trying to kind of like get order. And as they sort of moved out, obviously kind of creating tension with ethnic groups that they were in conflict with. But that particularly happened in places on the border, in Kachin states and Shan states up north and northeast. And in part that was because of the proximity of China and concern about nationalists, after the creation of the PRC, nationalists moving down into the country and the People's Republic kind of coming down in, right, to chase them. And so the tactics of the military to try to pacify and sort of centralize the country generated even more, right, discontent among ethnic groups. And so what we saw then, late 1950s, early 1960s, was the eruption of more violence that was met in part with a military coup then in 1962, right? And most of those kind of ethnic rebellions at that point, that they were mostly ethnic, then persisted in some form or another over the next, 50 years or so. So what we saw then in, the 2010s and in the aughts really was a kind of partial economic transition, right? Away from a sort of socialist state-led regime that really had been enacted kind of poorly. And so Myanmar had, shifted down to least developed country status by the end of the 1980s. So, popular discontent was really pushing the military to do something different, at least economically. And then my sense is that, like, throughout the 2000s, they saw other models. By this, I mean the sort of military leadership. They saw models of transition in places like Indonesia, where, a military could control a constitution process, could control a transition process to still keep a kind of formal role and control over the things that they wanted to. And that's what happened with the 2008 constitution, is that the military kept control of key ministries, right? They put clauses in there to say 25% of the parliaments are going to be appointed by the military, right? And so, they had a pretty good situation, right? A pretty good situation to maintain control on their terms. The 25% meant that any constitutional amendment that they didn't like, they could block, right? So, they could do it on their own terms, really. And I think that's what we saw through the first 5 years of what's kind of called the transition, as you saw, a kind of like post-military party, the USDP, led by Thein Sein, former, military officer, enacting quite a lot of change, but change on their own terms that they were, comfortable with, right? In 2015, the NLD, once they were allowed to kind of compete, won in a landslide, right? And I think that was a little bit destabilizing to the military, because they kind of thought, look, we've got our proxy party in here that has been praised for pushing forward these economic and political democratic reforms, yet you're still not voting for us, right? So I think that was a little frustrating. But then, for the NLD to kind of win an overwhelming victory in the 2020 election was even more, right? Even more problematic. Now, many of us did not actually think, many of us thought that, okay, the military is making the same kind of noise that a lot of people are making about elections, right? And election fraud. I think it's really important for us to recognize how much similar discourses in the US and in other places about election fraud influenced what the military could do, right? In claiming, election abnormalities and things like that. So we heard that, but still, many of us thought, why would you get rid of this situation? You still have control, right? It doesn't, in a way, it doesn't matter if Aung San Suu Kyi wins, if her party wins, if they have a majority in parliament, because the military still controls a lot of these things. But for whatever reason, Min Aung Hlaing, the commander-in-chief, didn't like the way that was moving, right? Wanted maybe more control over this, right? Wanted to neutralize some enemies, and so implemented the coup at that point in response, with the alleged argument that there were election inconsistencies, although there's no evidence for that.
Okay, now before, it's very interesting because you went into the history, and before I go to the contemporary situation, what strikes me as, again, I've told you that earlier, I'm not the greatest expert on Myanmar, but on the region, what strikes me is that, and maybe you can explain that, is that Myanmar was part, or Burma was part of British India. And then eventually the British left, and a few countries emerged out of this. When you talk about the military having a lot of control, for example, in British India, I see the same thing, for example, in a country like Pakistan, and I see the same thing in Myanmar. But I don't see it in a country, the biggest chunk of it, in India. So why is it that these three countries, which were all part of British India, when the British suddenly left, because in Pakistan's case, you can still explain it, probably, because apparently the Pakistan inherited much less of the landmass, while they inherited much more of the armed forces. So there might be explainable. How can you explain it in Myanmar's case?
Well, I think that probably some of this, and this maybe is not exactly an explanation for Myanmar in relation to Pakistan, but perhaps in relation to India, is that we can look at Myanmar's at the role of Myanmar, the Myanmar army, right, in the independence struggle as having had a direct role there. And it's a little bit of a confusing kind of flip-flop because, the British privileged non-Burmans, so the Burmans are the majority ethnic group in the country, The British privileged non-Burmans in recruiting to their colonial military in Myanmar, in Burma, and that was for a few reasons. One, because they didn't want to privilege the majority, but two, because many of the other ethnic groups had disproportionately converted to Christianity. So there felt like some kind of cultural similarities there. But what you had was a weird initial alliance where the Burman groups allied with the Japanese on one side, so we're kind of talking about early years of World War II, against the British and most of the other ethnic groups, right? To drive the British kind of out and away to the peripheries. Very quickly, the Burman groups realized that Japanese rule was not all that they expected it to be. And so within about a year and a half, they kind of switched sides, joining the British surreptitiously to expel the Japanese as part of World War II. So, you know, the kind of end of World War II and the beginnings of independence were deeply militarized in Burma at that time. So that's one of the kind of parts of it. But the fact that the Burmans and the non-Burman groups had been fighting on different sides for most of that conflict was kind of papered over, right, in the sort of push toward independence. And so at that point, the British, I think, wanting to hastily get out of there, were happy to just sort of give their imprimatur to the Burman side, led by Aung San, father of Aung San Suu Kyi, and the kind of father of Burmese independence, without worrying too much about how they were going to manage those things. But I think that made the military primacy, you know, that created the reputation, right, for the Burmese military in relation to independence, and kind of gave that iteration of it control of the country to start.
So in essence, Burmese independence from British colonialism was more entrenched into a military defeat of the British in comparison to India, where it was much more of a non-violent movement.
I think that's one of the big factors, talking about how the military plays this prominent role, but also overall the militarization of the country, right? Because if you've got, you know, World War II was fought in a very different way in Burma than it was in, you know, than it was in India. And so you had a country that was awash in weapons, right? And militarized throughout many parts of it, right? And destroyed, actually, through many parts of it. Yeah.
You have, of course, you were the inaugural senior research, Suu Kyi Senior Research Fellow in Modern Burmese Studies at Oxford. And maybe a bit of an uncomfortable question, but this is something I have here, is that Suu Kyi, of course, you know, was considered for a long time as the, you know, torchbearer of democracy. She was put in house arrest for a long time. Yet, when she came to power, she did defend the army at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. The question is that just plain realpolitik, or why would she do that? Because there was, at that time, she, you know, to say it that way, she fell from a pedestal for many people. There were people who said that her Nobel Prize should be taken back. So why do you think that happened?
Yeah, so this was, I mean, having this post at Oxford with her name attached to it, you know, it was kind of a fascinating 5 years from a moment when she was still kind of in that, you know, on that pedestal, as you say, this kind of human rights icon, to, you know, by the end of it, having gone through all of the Rohingya violence with, you know, with her either non-responses or responses supporting the military, you know, where that became a very different kind of thing to have attached to you. So I would have a few thoughts on this. And nothing that I'm saying am I trying to kind of absolve her. I mean, I deeply disagree with the choices that she made, you know, and I think they were probably influenced to some degree by a kind of personal bias and personal prejudice, and also by, you know, strategic action, right? And I think one of the things that's important for us, again, not to absolve, but to understand and explain is, you know, what were the kind of constraints that she and her party were facing, and how did she choose to respond to them as well? So a couple of things with Aung San Suu Kyi. if we look at her work in the late 80s and early 90s, her speeches, her written texts, things like that, we can certainly see support for democracy, right? And in some cases, support for a kind of like liberalism and liberal democratic ideals. My argument that I make in the book and that I've made for a long time is that we also see language that mirrors what we would call the disciplined democracy that we associate with the Myanmar military. Now, that's been their that's what guides the 2008 constitution, right? This disciplined, flourishing democracy, right? And so, this is maybe an implied idea in liberal democracy, but not something we focus on as much. But the idea that, like, look, if we're giving you this freedom, you got to use it the right way. And that is a very clear component of her political thought way back to the late 80s and 90s. There's also a clear component of what I might call a moral democracy, right? Or a kind of Buddhist inflected democracy that intersects with that disciplining, right? So it's kind of like, people need to be, citizens need to be good people, making the good choices, right? Making good choices for themselves and for others. And, we gloss that in Western liberal democracies in a lot of different ways. People complain about uneducated voters or whatever it might be, or immoral, valueless voters. But it has a very specific Buddhist inflection for Buddhist moral values and selflessness in Aung San Suu Kyi's work. Now, what also happened around this time was that as her stature was growing among Burmese people because of the bravery and the sacrifices that she and others in her party made throughout the 1990s, the global campaign to draw attention to her plight and the plight of democracy and political change in Burma was solely highlighting the kind of liberal democratic components of what she did, right? And that was strategic in a lot of ways. We saw academics doing this. That's part of what the Nobel Prize was about, right? Making her into a human rights icon, which was, I would say, a role and a title that she embraced at times when it was strategic and useful for her, and then subsequently was very happy to say, I'm not a human rights icon. I've always been a politician, right? And I think that in and of itself was a political move for her, right? But what happened then during the 1990s and the 2000s, I think, was that not only was Aung San Suu Kyi largely under house arrest, not only was her party kind of like decimated by the military, right, through arrests and all sorts of other legal moves, right? But this really constrained what the democratic movement could do in the country for almost 2 decades. And one of the graduate students that I work with at Oxford, Richard Rower, writes about the way in which the kind of authoritarian context in which the NLD kind of was created and came of age as a party also had effects on how they governed themselves, right? How they, what kind of democracy they allowed within their party, and effects on how they governed once they got power, right? And so I think what we saw with Aung San Suu Kyi was somebody who really saw the constraints, the constitutional constraints, right, the other political constraints, and she believed that the only way that she was going to make change was through some sort of compromise with the military, right? Now, for me as a political scientist, assessing that, I think that's logical, right? That makes sense. Very few, it's really difficult to point to democratic transitions that happen against a military as well equipped and as entrenched as the Myanmar military, right? Most of these are going to be pacted transitions that will move gradually, allowing militaries to keep a little bit of power, to transition out into civilian guise. And I think that's what she was dedicated to. It's not entirely clear that the military was willing to kind of do that with her as well. And I think, again, so once we got to the violence against the Rohingya in 2016 and 2017, the specific, acts of expulsion that have been labeled by many groups now as genocide, she was in a bind, or saw herself as in a bind, right? She needed to kind of keep pursuing this, if not alliance, at least kind of good relationship with the military. Now, does that require you to go to the ICJ and defend genocide? I mean, I would say not, right? But this is what it's hard for us to parse, the degree to which she felt constrained and obligated to kind of do that, to salvage, right, the transition, to salvage that kind of pacted possibility. But certainly, I think there were aspects of, a kind of national pride that played into it as well. I think she did not like the fact that, she had been praised and lauded by all of the Western governments, when she first got out of house arrest and, was elected to parliament. And then when she got into power, right? And to be, in her eyes, again, be blamed for something that this other institution did, right? That she didn't have control over. I think there was some defensiveness to that. But it's, still inexcusable, in my view, to have gone and, and launched a defense of genocide, along with a whole lot of lies about the Rohingya and about the military campaign in there that her administration put forward, right? So it was a kind of deserved fall from grace in those respects.
She basically ended up being more of a politician than a human rights activist.
She claims she always was, right? And I think that's true to some degree, right? But this was a case where she was absolutely, for whatever reason, willing to kind of strategically sacrifice the Rohingya for broader political interests, right? For the transition. And, that's something that somebody who is a genuine human rights icon might not be willing to do, right?
Yeah. No, and in your book, you of course, and in your research, you of course also focus a lot on. Now we come to that when we talk about the Rohingyas and we talk about religion. Like in many parts of the world, of course, religion always, in some way, ends up being politicized, political, and then you have these definitions of, you have Islamic terrorism, you have Christian supremacy. But you talk about Buddhist nationalism, and those two things, so nationalism and religion, seems to be very contradictory. While in your work you make the case that this is very much entrenched into Myanmar. So again, this is a very open question, and then of course we can come to the Rohingya issues, because that's also embedded into religion. But what exactly is this religion or Buddhist nationalism we talk about in Myanmar?
Yeah, so it's a really important question to kind of like put them there, and I like the way you described it as, these are whatever we might imagine the source of our religion and our religious values to be, humans have created them, right? And humans interpret them, right? And that's just the way that goes. So in my mind, that means that they are inherently kind of political constructs, right? That we don't, that whatever truth might be there, we as humans are the ones who are arguing over the truth, right? And so, as a scholar, I'm always, my antenna go up when I hear claims of like true Buddhism, right? A real Muslim, right? Because, those are political claims, right? And they might be for good purposes, right? They might be to try to, inculcate peace or something like that, but they are still political claims because it's attempting to kind of define what is truly in a religion and what is not. And so I'm particularly interested in the ways that those things change, and especially the ways in which something like Buddhism can, at times and under certain circumstances, merge with a kind of national political identity as well, right? Or in the case of Myanmar, a range of national and subnational political identities as well, because we've got all these ethnic groups in Myanmar, some of which are Buddhist, some of which are Christian, a handful of which are Muslim as well, or majority Muslim. So the first kind of thing to say is that there is no kind of inherent Buddhist nationalism, right? What we get, in my opinion, is sets of circumstances that kind of allow somebody to imagine that their Buddhism and their Buddhist identity and their national identity kind of either support each other or are inextricably intertwined, right? So there's a long history in Buddhist polities or Buddhist influenced polities of a kind of coexistence, right, between a religious community like the Sangha, which is the Pali word we use for the group of monks, and the king, the monarch, right, whatever the polity is. So there's a long history of a kind of interaction between them, and in ideal situations, those are complementary, right? The kind of king supports the monks, and the monks, act as a kind of moral guide on the king. That's usually more ideal than than in practice.
In every religious.
Right, exactly, yeah. So we've got those relationships that are there. And that has become, I think, more complicated in the sort of modern era because of the nature, because our political identities and our political communities have become more strictly bounded, right? Nation state boundaries are there. They matter in particular ways, but they don't always map on easily to how Buddhists understand their community, right? How Muslims understand their community as well. And so, so for some, right, nation states are kind of anathema to a religious identity, right? A nation state is not what matters for, to some Buddhists, to some Muslims. And a nation state is just a kind of worldly, mundane identity. But for others, they see the nation state as necessary to support the religious community as well, right? And so we see those things coming together. And certainly we've seen moments of what we might call kind of a Buddhist nationalism emerge in Myanmar in the past, right? So we had moments, from the fall of the last Burmese monarchy in 1890s, all the way up to independence in 1948. We saw movements of monks, led by monks, who were connecting political independence to what I would call a kind of like spiritual liberation, right? So monks complaining, look, now we've got these heathen British in charge, and not only are they going to repress you politically, but they're not going to support Buddhism, and you're not going to be able to, practice in the right way that you should, right? So we see those moments of that. But a series of particular things, I think, have enabled this moment, right? This more recent moment of Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar. And it's important to kind of name some of those in particular ways. One of the more important ones, I think, and one of the ways in which it has pushed a kind of Buddhist nationalism that in the past might have been anti-colonial or something like that, pushed it in an explicitly anti-Muslim way, has been what I would call the kind of global war on terror discourse, right? So this is the post 9/11, one that institutionalizes the figure of the Muslim terrorist, right? And, to the exclusion of any other possible religious terrorist. And that has had at least two influences on Buddhists and monks in Burma. One is that it's sort of influenced their thinking, right? Like they are then more inclined, if they see, the discourse from the West, if they see news, right? More inclined to kind of make those connections between Islam and terrorism, between Muslims and terrorism. And frankly, we've done some, research groups of mine have done some little informal studies where we've just tried to look at Burmese language newspapers, take a week or two looking at them, looking at the international news, right? We have never once found a positive story about Muslims or Muslim majority countries. Right? Does that make that, so it's a kind of bias in the media that we know exists. I mean, this is why Al Jazeera and other networks are founded, but every day, nobody, who's reading Myanmar media is getting a kind of positive image. And the only images they're getting are related to terrorism or violence or something like that. But then once these campaigns started in 2010, 2011, there's a kind of international justification, right? These monks can then point to, US presidents and, campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places against Islamic terrorism, right? And they can point to that to try to frame a threat internally in Myanmar. So that global war on terror discourse was a really important component of what enabled this present moment. The other kind of component of it is what I'd call the uncertainty of the transition, right? So I don't particularly like the arguments about political transition in Myanmar that imply that somehow military rule was good because it was brutal and repressive enough to keep people from fighting among each other, right? I think often this is how, like, the regimes in Pakistan have, justified, right, some of their policies, but also pushing back against democracy as well. We see this in Myanmar too. I don't agree with those arguments, but what the democratic transition did, as all democratic transitions do, it introduced uncertainty, right? Political uncertainty, the networks of patronage, the kind of positions that people had built up, whether you're a monk or a business person or a soldier, those things shifted in a way that you couldn't predict, right? The next election, that's what's beautiful about democracy. But that was terrifying to a lot of entrenched kind of power interests, right? And what goes along with that, as Myanmar has been, let's call it opening up, although I don't really like that phrase, but as it's been opening up kind of culturally, technologically, everything like that, there's this real, anxiety about what sort of modernity writ large is going to do to Buddhism, right? Kids these days, this is the like kids these days argument, right? Short skirts are too short, kids are going online to look at pornography, whatever these arguments are, they add to a general anxiety, but nobody can point to like modernity as the culprit, right? You need a culprit that you can name, that you can blame, that is the threat to your religion. And that's where these things combined, a kind of anxiety and uncertainty about political and social transitions, but then an easy narrative to fall back on to say, these Muslim populations are the real threats to Buddhism. And so that's what has enabled, I think, the particular, kind of language of Buddhist nationalism now. There's one other thing I want to say with that. So we look at a lot of these movements, had a research project looking at the main one, Mabatha, for several years. And what I think is important is for us to understand that a group like Mabatha, which was formed in 2013 and was kind of really powerful through 2014 and 15, and then kind of dropped off in its influence after the NLD came into power. The way I like to describe it is that for decades, there hadn't been a kind of religious political discourse in Myanmar, right? People hadn't really been connecting Buddhist ideas and political ideas. And when Mabatha came in and said, that we need to protect our religion and our nation, right, and our people, and link them together, it kind of took up all the air in the room, right? It became the dominant discourse for that. And it was really hard for other articulations of like Buddhism in the transition to come out. But we saw a lot of them, right? For every anti-Muslim action, right? For every anti-Muslim like article or sermon or speech, there were dozens and dozens and dozens of Buddhists, of instances of Buddhists, supporting their religion in peaceful ways, right? Living peacefully with their neighbors, trying to figure out, how they could protect Buddhism in a time of uncertainty and also, live peacefully with others. So I think it's important for us to recognize that the anti-Muslim Buddhist nationalism was really important and really destructive, but it was only a particular kind of stream of this movement, right? And that took up a lot of the air in the room.
But there have been like they were at the ICJ. People have called about, people say that it's ethnic cleansing has been happening in Myanmar. They call it genocide. Yeah. Not by getting into a debate on the definitions of genocide and ethnic cleansing. I know those can get complicated, but how do you view it? Was it of such an extent that even colloquially speaking, we could talk about ethnic cleansing and genocide?
Absolutely. Against the Rohingya, absolutely. There's no question about that. I think that a lot of groups were slow to come to that, that language and that description. And you're right, there was a lot of politics around how and when we name genocide as such. But it absolutely was. I mean, if we, and so, what happened with the Rohingya coincided with this, this particularly virulent strain of Buddhist nationalism, right? But it was also kind of embedded in several other processes that are happening. So number one is very specifically, sort of inserted into what I described before, the kind of global war on terror discourse, right? So, so Rohingya had been, kind of persecuted and oppressed for a long time in Myanmar, but in more isolated ways, let's say, right? But with the kind of sudden appearance, right, in in 2016 of an allegedly Islamic, kind of group defending the Rohingya, that provided, a kind of full justification for, extensive military action, right? So that's one kind of component that's going on there. That's what enables, in part, the level of violence, enables and justifies the level of violence. But you've also got kind of like land politics and electoral politics happening as well. So, Rakhine State in the west that borders Bangladesh had a population largely just distributed between the ethnic Rakhine, who are also Buddhists, and ethnic Rohingya, who are predominantly Muslims. And it, prior to the violence in 2016, 2017, Rakhines were more, somewhere over 50%. Rakhines were the larger population, but Rohingya were still a sizable part of that population. And so what you kind of had emerging from there over the last 50 years was an increasing kind of separation between the communities. So prior to independence in 1948 and in the years following independence, there was violence between Rohingya and Rakhine communities there. And what happened was a more integrated population kind of, split apart, right? So you had more Rohingya communities moving to and living in the Northwest and more Rakhine living in the southern and eastern part of the state, right? And that has then, in Myanmar's new political environment, created the possibility for kind of like reasonable narratives about secession, even though there are virtually no Rohingya talking about secession, right? But Myanmar's constitution provides for representation by minority ethnic groups of a particular population. And so this has been part of what people can say about to justify violence against the Rohingya, to say, we're scared because they're going to try to secede. They're going to try to join Bangladesh. They're going to make a stronger, Islamic state on our border, Islamic country on our border, right? There's no calls for independence or secession among the Rohingya, right? But it's those kind of like geopolitical and demographic components that, create a sort of perfect storm that allows for this kind of violence there. The other component that's there is also, to be frank, a kind of racialized component, right? So there are ways in which the language on race and ethnicity in Burmese is not always clear. There are languages, there's words that we use to kind of, that seem to mean race and ethnicity and nationality all at once. But there is a perception that Rohingya are darker skinned South Asians, right? And so there is a kind of racial component to that as well, where, where people have been, where Rohingya communities and even darker skinned other groups in Myanmar have been, subjected to violence just because of that perception, right? Of the way in which that marks on to, race, skin color marks on to not only ideas of religion and religious identity, but to ideas of foreigner, right? Somebody who doesn't belong here in this country. So you've got all those things happening.
But this has, of course, also had its blowback, in the sense that now you have ethnically armed organizations who are fighting this. And where do you see them standing? Do they make a chance? How are they going to pursue this? What is going to happen to them?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, some of them, as we talked about earlier on, have been fighting essentially since before independence and right after independence. So this is decades in the making. Over the last 20, 25 years, most of the ethnic armed groups have shifted their expectations and their demands from independence or secession to participation in a more federal type of government, right? And there was a really frustrating dynamic that was happening after the transition, where a lot of foreign advisors and observers would say, yeah, the ethnic groups are calling for this, but when we say federalism, they don't know what they mean, right? They don't know what they want. And in a lot of cases, that wasn't actually true, right? Some of these groups had been developing very sophisticated, models of what it was that they wanted. But in other cases, of course, what they wanted was like some sort of recognition and respect and autonomy within, some degrees of autonomy within the country. And we see that as an essential part of federalism, in almost every space. Now, they've known that the only way that they're going to get that is to sort of maintain the threat of arms, right? I mean, that is unfortunately one of the only languages that the Burmese military speaks. And so, most of them have kept their armed movements, at the same time creating very effective governing infrastructures, right? So the Karen, which is an ethnic group kind of on the eastern, part of Myanmar, but also spread out across other states, have developed, forestry ministries and education ministries and their own curricula that they're teaching, right? And health ministries and all these things. To the point that there have been times in the past when people living in Yangon would travel to the border because they'd get better healthcare there, they get better services there, right? So there's a level of competence that has been there, and that a lot of these ethnic groups have been, showing that they are administrative groups as well, right? That they can govern themselves, and that they're that really they're ready, right, to be part of a federal system as long as they're being respected. Now, one of the interesting things that's happened, so we can look at the coup last year and what's happened in the last year plus, a little bit in comparison with what happened after 1988 and 1990, right? So 1988 was the big protests and strikes. And then 1990 was when the military-led government had called for an election, but then didn't really honor the results. And so there were protests again. And after both those periods, a number of students and political leaders fled out of the cities into, into the ethnic states on the border. Some of them joined these armed movements. And we've seen the same thing happening today, or for the last year as well. One of the biggest differences, though, is that when you talk to ethnic armed groups and their soldiers from the 1980s and 90s, you get a sense that there was still so what they would maybe call a kind of Burman supremacy, right? Burman Buddhist supremacy kind of idea, that the Burmans were the real Myanmar people. And these were like ethnic younger brothers and sisters kind of thing. You get a lot of that in the narrative, right? And as a result, a lot of those coalitions didn't really last very long. And they were, once they moved out to the kind of jungles and forest areas, they didn't have an effect on domestic politics in the big cities. This is now a very different dynamic today, right? So not only do we have people moving out there, you have a really strong discourse of respect for the ethnic groups that have been fighting for a long time, and a public self-critique from Burman Buddhists, many of them who are talking about on Facebook and other social media, saying, I'm sorry that I didn't recognize these dynamics earlier. I'm sorry that we didn't really see how you were being treated, and commitments to doing something differently, right? Commitments of respect and commitments to a kind of different type of federal system in the future. And that's complemented then by these PDFs, these People's Defense Forces, right? Which are not only Burman-led, right? But they are popping up in all sorts of places where the ethnic armed groups aren't, right? To continue the struggle in other places. You've got urban kind of guerrilla warfare happening with other groups in the cities. And so you get a real sustained sense of, a greater degree of solidarity than you saw, 30 years.
That's of course, that's one of the questions I also had, that whether this will end up bringing some people together. probably socially it will. But on the other hand, you just said that, you know, the Burmese army is the only language they speak or understand is, of course, the language of the gun. And militarily speaking, these ethnically armed groups, what chance do they make against the Burmese army? Because and that was the foreign relations of the Burmese army, because the Burmese army is supported by, allegedly supported by the Chinese. You know, when you were talking about the Rohingyas, it also reminded me a little bit about the plight of the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. So militarily, probably they don't make a chance, and maybe a social change can erupt bottom up. But what role does China play in this conundrum, especially when it also the coup happened? I remember that famous line of, I think it was a foreign minister, saying that they have taken note of a small cabinet reshuffle in Myanmar. How do you see China, which is not the obvious democratic you know, country in the region, how do you see them playing a role here?
Yeah, so before I get to China, I just want to address the kind of like the military question there, right? So, you know, for decades, many of these armed groups, while never reaching the numbers or, you know, the level of being armed as the Burmese military, you know, have effectively fought them to, you know, a stalemate in many situations, and have often, you know, driven them out of territory, right? So this is an unequal battle, but one in which the arms that the Burmese military has had haven't always made up for, you know, their lack of training, or the fact that they treat their soldiers terribly, right? I mean, this is a network of indebtedness, right, and an obligation that creates more hatred when they send soldiers out to places, because they don't pay their soldiers enough. And so soldiers go and confiscate food from people, you know, local people, in order to live. So, you know, they're generating a lot of hostility in doing that. And in part, that's what's allowed some of these ethnic armed groups to, you know, to survive and even, you know, win some of these battles. But they are not getting that sufficient support to beat the military now, right? I mean, this is a kind of sustained, like, guerrilla sort of battle in a lot of places. And, you know, pretty much no Western country has been willing to kind of arm these groups. Obviously, the situation is different politically than it is in Ukraine, right? But the relative openness to support a resistance movement in Ukraine against Russian invasion, you know, we haven't seen any of that. And frankly, the National Unity Government, the sort of shadow government that's formed representing the people who are resisting, and the PDF groups are basically crowdfunding. I mean, this is a resistance that couldn't have happened, you know, 10 years ago without the sort of infrastructure that we have to do that. But they are fighting, right? And there is for so many people a kind of, you know, a sense of no return, right? That whatever compromises seemed possible over the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s are done, right? Those seem to be obliterated by, and that's the sense from a larger group here. So then we get to China. And it is absolutely, you know, the case that China has been a strong support for Myanmar in a variety of different ways. So in terms of military support, in terms of cover at the UN and in other kinds of international bodies for that. China is also a huge investor in Myanmar as well. It's a little complicated because a few of the ethnic armed groups up along the border in Kachin and Shan states are also you know, are kind of more ethnically closer to China and getting arms from China as well. So that's always been a kind of balance that the Chinese government in its national and then provincial forms has always had to navigate, right? So the United Wa State Army, for example, is the only entity that, you know, seems kind of able to stand up to the Myanmar military in terms of its firepower and things like that. And it has close relations with China too. the interesting thing that's happening here is that although Myanmar is still getting kind of the Myanmar coup government is still getting support from China, my sense is that the Chinese government wants predictability, right? They want stability. And so, for decades, supporting a Myanmar military government gets them stability, it gets them access. That's great. That's the obvious choice, right? A year and a half of instability in Myanmar, of unpredictability, right, is not to their benefit. It's certainly not to the benefit of any of the Chinese companies that have a lot invested in, in the Myanmar economy and in different sectors and things like that. And so, I think that might be one reason why we've seen support, but maybe kind of more tepid support than you might expect, precisely because I think the Chinese government has an interest in getting to stability sooner rather than later, right? And even prior to the coup, we saw some interesting dynamics where, you sort of felt in the first 5 years of the transition that the USDP government, which was the kind of military proxy party, was more of the group that was opening up to Western investment and, to better relationships with countries in the West, in part because there seemed to be a sense of skepticism and worry from military leaders of an over-reliance on China, right? Over-dependence on China. And what you saw then when the National League for Democracy with Aung San Suu Kyi was in power from 2015 to 2020 was her reaching out to China, forming closer relations with China, again, partly because that's how she saw, Myanmar's sort of regional economic future moving, but also partly to have an independent relationship with them that wasn't facilitated through the military, right? So, the Chinese government, I think, has been pretty smart at maintaining these relationships with all the sides. I would be shocked if they weren't, if people connected to the Chinese government weren't also having conversations with the National Unity Government and with the shadow government, and maybe not supplying arms, but still trying to maintain those relationships just to keep things open. But the fact of the matter is that even minimal support from a country like China, a country like Russia, and even regional partners like Thailand is more than enough to keep the Myanmar military government going. Right? I mean, it's crippled, but it is still functional.
There was hasn't it? There have been scholars who are saying that Chinese involvement in the region, and maybe maybe that's also the reason that at some point of time people in Myanmar were looking not to be over reliant on China, but you have seen Chinese influence in Sri Lanka and where the country is heading now. You see that, for example, also in Pakistan, where a lot of investment of China is and where there is also an economic crisis. And you see that in Myanmar as well. Is there some kind of, is there some kind of regional, acceptance or acknowledgement of the fact that this over-reliance on China is actually more hurtful than it benefits them?
Yeah, I think that's a really difficult calculation for all the people who are involved, right? I mean, the political figures and others, because there are certainly moments of, kind of what we might call xenophobic, or at least in this case, anti-Chinese kind of like economic nationalism, right? So one of the really prominent ones was in the early years of the transition when the president, to everyone's shock, put a pause on the very controversial Mitzone Dam project in Kachin State that was Chinese funded. And this was a surprise because nobody expected the sort of military proxy party to do that. And the Chinese government reacted, as affronted, for all this. But in my estimation, really what happened was that project was the kind of sacrificial lamb to show, we're listening to people, we're not just going to let, this foreign country take over, that allowed dozens of other major infrastructural and investment projects to kind of move forward largely unaddressed, right, in the rest of the country. So I think that local leaders have tried to maneuver and find ways to, appease anti-Chinese worry or, kind of this nationalist sentiment, while also recognizing that there probably isn't really much of another option for them in terms of, in terms of rapid investment and economic development for that. But I mean, there's a way in which,
but in essence, doesn't it end up, isn't Myanmar, again, colloquially speaking, basically, now that the army is ruling there as well, a modern day colony of China?
A kind of client state for that, or colony. I mean, the Myanmar military has a long history of really trying to avoid that, right? I mean, from the 1950s, this was one of the things that motivated a lot of their tactics was to not, be overtaken in the north by China. And so I think that, their desire for external support is really mediated by, that desire to remain independent there. And so I think many of these countries are kind of doing everything they can to avoid fully becoming kind of client states, right? But knowing that some degree of dependence, on this state is necessary. And the dynamics of that changed after 2016, 2017, because you saw investment in Myanmar from 2010 to 2017 really diversifying, right? You had a lot of companies from different countries coming in, a lot of different projects, and then as a response to the Rohingya genocide, many of those countries pulled out their monetary support or lessened it. A lot of companies from other places started to rethink that as well. So post 2017. The pendulum swung the other way, and a country like Myanmar had fewer options to go, right? So they had to become more dependent in that way. But I think Myanmar's leaders have always looked also to regional blocs like ASEAN, right? Because investment from Thailand and Singapore and other countries is still really high, as a way of kind of counterbalancing the Chinese influence there.
But and we're getting to ASEAN as well. So, to sum you, it is quite clear that, while the different parties in Myanmar try to not become a full client state of China, currently with the military in Myanmar, it basically it is a vassal state of China. And now you're talking about other options. Well, one of the options is, of course, ASEAN. And what role should they play? Because I know that they didn't invite them for the last meeting they had. There were talks going on about expelling Myanmar. So what role could that act as a counterbalance to this Chinese influence, or is that too small?
Yeah, so in terms of investment and balancing investment, yes, right? I mean, Thailand remains one of the major trading partners, right, and investors in Myanmar, and other regional ASEAN countries are high up on that list as well. So in terms of direct investment, yes, that is a balancing thing. But in terms of politics, I mean, I think our expectations of ASEAN need to be pretty low, and I think ASEAN has proved itself, to be very capable of kind of regional integration, right? But not necessarily of effective response to domestic political crises, because ASEAN is guided by this famous non-interference principle, right? Which is, partly, I think partly it's a tactic so that the different countries can maintain access to each other, right? You actually hear this a lot in ASEAN representatives' language about being able to go, we're the only ones who can go in and talk to the generals, right? And these other states don't have access. So we need to keep that access. And in order to keep it, we can't be too critical, right? And then the other one is the kind of like self-defense argument, which is to say, we're not going to get into skeletons in your closet because we don't want you to do it, to us next year when we start repressing X minority group in our country. And so, there was talk about this. There's I think, Certain leaders in ASEAN, Malaysian leaders in particular, were very vocal and very critical after the Rohingya crisis in 2016, 2017. We saw a few individual leaders be critical after the coup as well. And ASEAN leaders, I think, have always kind of played with, like, let's try to do the bare minimum. As you said, there were some disinvitations or uninvitations, but those were papered over through kind of bureaucratic language. That wasn't a, you're not invited because you are, gunning down civilians on the street. And ASEAN this week is having a defense ministers meeting where the Myanmar defense minister is there, right? So I don't think that ASEAN is going to be a kind of political force for political change in there. But it remains crucial for Myanmar to have the access, to them for economic reasons.
As long as they are not going to be a political change and China is supporting the military, there wouldn't be a change then.
No, and I think that's what's scary about this situation. On the one hand, it is deeply inspiring, right, to have watched so many people, kind of stand up and take risks and sacrifice so much for, these, kind of dreams, whether they're democratic dreams or dreams of kind of peace and coexistence, to do that. But it is really hard. In history, as I said before, we don't have a lot of these, we don't have a lot of examples of, domestic resistance movements that are relatively poorly armed, defeating a military without some sort of, exogenous shock or without, support from, from external actors. And we don't really see that right now. So it's hard to see anything other than this kind of status quo, which is destructive for so many people.
But isn't it, I get that. And I find it also, of course, a lot of it is politics, but one could say that, why support the Ukrainian people fighting the Russians and not do that with the organizations in Myanmar. But don't you think that one of the reasons of that is also because then you're actually getting into a conflict with China?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I have no doubt that that is one of the big factors that has prevented, countries like the US or the UK or others from taking a more kind of like active, visible role, right? I mean, let's not forget that, there's no proxy conflict with Russia in Ukraine. There's a much more direct conflict there, which I think has, had an effect on the ways in which, the US and other European countries have supported Ukraine, right? But they have, found ways to do that. I think there's also the fact that what we're talking about in Ukraine is a foreign invasion, right? Versus a kind of civil conflict and a coup. And I think when it comes down to it, most of the countries in the UN, no matter how they might be critical of the Myanmar military, are unwilling in most situations to kind of violate norms of sovereignty there, right? I mean, the Ukrainian conflict is responding to a norm of sovereignty.
We have seen many American governments trying to overthrow even democratically elected governments in countries.
Right. So that's the other thing, right? That's exactly where I was going to go, which is to say, unwilling to do that unless there is a kind of clear strategic or economic kind of imperative. And Myanmar offers none of that, really, right? I mean, there's no upside to it, and that is the sad kind of geostrategic truth. There's no kind of reason. There was every reason for the Obama administration to kind of open its arms to the transition and to work with them, but every geostrategic reason not to get more involved with that. And unfortunately, despite, as you say correctly, a history of the US and Western countries getting involved in deeply destructive ways, picking sides in domestic conflicts, they're unlikely to do it in this situation.
And one of the biggest factors on top of that is almost getting into a conflict or an open conflict with the Chinese side, of course.
Yeah, it definitely risks that, right? And certainly there are many other parts of Southeast Asia where the US in particular is all but in a kind of open conflict with with China and South China Sea, kind of like dominance and jockeying, and I don't think they want to risk something where the stakes for them are so
So
low.
the geostrategic position of, say, a Taiwan would justify, in the US perspective, to get involved, but the position of Myanmar wouldn't.
No, and I think there's certainly a history with Taiwan, obviously, but we've even seen what I would say is a kind of the U.S. government making every effort not to push that commitment to defend Taiwan all the way up to the edge, right? And so I think they're trying to avoid a direct conflict with China in every one of those ways.
No, we're actually coming to the end of the interview, and I've just one end question for you, and that is two ways. Is that in many ways you've described how the situation is now, and it doesn't make me optimistic about the future, at least in democratic terms. But you also talked about a little bit of hope where you see some social changes on the ground. So what are we looking at in Myanmar in, let's say, 5 years? Will this military rule actually bring those people very much together, and could there be a miracle, or is this going to continue and at some point of time it will disperse and the military will still be there?
Right. Yeah. So I like the way you put that question, and I'm really glad that you kind of picked up on the kind of, yes, we've got this entrenched military, but in the response we have not only kind of like the generation of solidarity, right, a stronger solidarity than we've seen, but also really strong impulses for social change, right? And I think that and that's kind of where I want to start with this is because we have seen so much of that, right? I mean, so much of the kind of public face of a lot of these movements is young people who are in really, I think, productive ways, questioning, tradition or received norms, things like that. So, pushing back, and men and women pushing back against gender norms in the midst of conflict to say, look, what we've been repressed, or we've been repressing our sisters and mothers and daughters in these ways. And we need to, this is a moment while we are fighting for our lives to be doing so in a way that creates an alternative kind of social arrangement, right? And so we see this, sometimes the older generations of politicians are dragged kicking and screaming towards this. So the National Unity Government, the shadow government, has some folks who have been, elected to positions from the NLD and from other parties. It also has a lot of activists and a lot of different kind of political and social figures. It's incredibly diverse, ethnically, gender-wise, religiously, right? But in some ways, it has had to be pushed into certain positions, right? So the NUG statement on the Rohingya was more than any Burmese political group has ever done, but also was the result of a lot of lobbying, a lot of listening, right? A lot of arguing about these sorts of things, right? And in a way that is inspiring, right? To see those, even those old school politicians realizing, the winds have changed and this is the way that the people are going to go now. That also suggests that there is no easy end to this conflict, right? That you have people who are now irrevocably alienated, right? I mean, when you're fighting in the streets for months and months at a time, there is no easy way to go back, right? Whether you are somebody who's resisting the government in the streets, or whether, as we've recently seen in an article that I think was from Radio Free Asia, they had found a Burmese army soldier's discarded cell phone that had a whole bunch of pictures and videos and things like that of him and his comrades speaking really glibly about the people that they had killed and how they had done that, right? So they don't come back from that easily either, right? And so it's really hard to see what the resolution is for that. But what we do see is a commitment among the wide range of groups in the resistance to kind of building something separate, building something parallel, not letting the decades of ethnic armed groups be hierarchies in these kind of gendered ways or hierarchies in these religious ways, to really push everybody to be kind of, mounting the resistance in other ways. That solidarity and that sense of we're not going back suggests that this is just going to be a really awful, protracted conflict. I think it is very unlikely that if the Myanmar military holds elections in 2023 or something like that, there's going to be a lot of people who don't participate. There already are people opting out of the education system, right? The kids who got enrolled in the kind of military-run schools, the junta schools, the numbers have dropped precipitously because people are educating their kids outside of that, right? And people are, creating these kind of parallel spaces. So that optimism that I have is also the reason why I think there's pessimism about, this resolving in some way, because all of the kind of pacted versions that we see in the region in history are not going to be an option here for a while. People are still too angry, and the fighting has been way too much. So I think for the next couple of years, very sadly, unless something unexpected happens, right, in terms of support, for the opposition in some ways, that we're likely to kind of see this protracted conflict. And the only real hope, or the big hope, is that the people who are resisting can sustain kind of these societal cultural changes that they're doing, that they're leading there, so that what comes out on the other end is not a repetition of what's happened in the past, but of something that reflects a kind of, new set of social relationships there.
And now, of course, even if there is outside of sport, it's still prolonging conflict.
It will, yeah.
So unfortunately, in the coming years, hello?
Yeah.
Hear me? Oh, sorry. So unfortunately, I just got, I think something happened with EFSAS, with the account. So unfortunately, in the coming years, probably we might still end up of having the military government in power. And even if things would change, like you said, with an election coming up, maybe, they would still remain in power with their proxies.
Yeah, in power with their proxies, with a large portion of the population, either choosing not to participate or actively resisting, right? Which will make at least kind of two, two governments and two communities in the country there.
Dr. Walton, thank you very much for this interview, and I'm unfortunately can't end on a better note. But that's also the reality, and I do hope what you've said, that indeed, it reminds me in some ways a little bit about things which happened in South Africa. At some point of time, the people among themselves realized, and then of course they had this Commission of Truth and Reconciliation. Maybe that is something in the long run, in the very long future, which is something which Myanmar also might need.
I mean, I think people are talking about that. People are, it's what's inspiring also is that people are talking about things like trauma. People are talking, and like the trauma of going through not just the conflict of the last year, but decades, in the past, talking about the trauma of having been in the military, right? What it takes to, be fighting against your fellow citizens in those ways. And I think, many of my colleagues look at, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, they look at political change like South Africa, but they also know the weaknesses of those transitions, right? They know the ways in which, the ANC very quickly became an entrenched hierarchical party, and in which, kind of racial discrimination persists. And, they want to learn from those, and they want to change and do better for whatever emerges in Myanmar. So I am, that is the hopeful note that I choose to kind of focus on, even though we know that the short-term result is likely to be increased, or ongoing fighting and violence.
Thank you very much for joining us again and for making time for us. And hopefully, when things get a bit better, or if there are a few changes, and you also suggested to us to maybe get in touch with some of these people who are actually in the shadow government. So hopefully we can do this soon again on Myanmar, but then maybe with a better outlook or a more positive outlook.
Yeah, no, I think that would be great. And I think a lot of the people in Myanmar are happy to kind of talk about their experiences and their perspectives. And I think that would be great for the folks who are watching your videos as well. So
thank you very much.
thanks, Junaid.